Unfortunately, humans are the biggest weakness in organizations, and it's because everyone's trying to be nice, like tailgating and, data centers was a big thing for such a long time when people actually had data centers because people would just hold the door open for them. But you don't know if that person is allowed to go into the data center, the physical data center or not. So yeah, they are trying to be helpful, but unfortunately, sometimes that's not what cybersecurity needs. They need people who are more cautious.
All right, I'm joined today by Lori Crooks, who's a specialist in cybersecurity auditing, has been doing this for about 20 years. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm curious, I wanted to talk with you about, there's a new standard in relation to organizations that are part of the defense industrial base and doing cybersecurity for those organizations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And the fun acronym is CMMC, which stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification.
Yeah, they always have these fantastic acronyms and then acronyms of acronyms, both in cybersecurity and in the government. So
yeah, it's just, we call it alphabet soup. With all the acronyms. But yeah.
So what is CMMC and why is it so important, particularly right now?
Well, the main thing is they just came out last year and said, okay, starting last November, those with a level 1, and I'll get into the details later, had to be compliant by last November. And then this November, anyone with level 2 has to be compliant by this November because they're going to start putting it in contracts. And that's for any DOD, or DOW, whatever you call it now, contractors, but also all of the flow down people and subcontractors through that. So it affects a lot of organizations that don't even realize that it affects them. So if you're a sub of a sub of a sub that's working for DOD, you have to put these 110 controls in place if you're level 2. And it's a lot of cybersecurity that's, most organizations, small mom and pop shops at that level don't know about. But it's all around trying to protect another acronym, CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information, from actually getting out. So it's not classified information, it's not top secret, but it is what's considered controlled unclassified, which is basically if you take tech drawings or sketches or anything that might be used within a warship or a submarine or something that the Department of Defense is using, that could be considered controlled unclassified information, because if somebody steals that, then they know the scheme of the warship.
So CMMC is Department of Defense, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, and I would imagine what's happened with the history of CMMC is that just looking over the last 10 years or so, we're doing all the amazing innovation and stuff that we do here in America, and maybe cybersecurity hasn't been real great. Okay, it's been terrible at some of these organizations.
I mean, if we want to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, so probably, the Chinese, the Russians, the whoever have, if they want to get a hold of this information that you're talking about, maybe some drawings, maybe some plans. Okay, it might be hard to get like the quote unquote the plans from the big company that's actually doing the building, but they can say, well, maybe the subcontractor is, a sub of a sub, and going on down and some of these smaller, maybe mom and pop type organizations that don't have good cybersecurity, they might be able to kind of either piece things together or kind of backdoor their way in and still be able to compile all of that information.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly what they're concerned about. And I'm assuming it's happened, which is why they kind of put this into place previously. But yeah, I don't think everyone understands the impact it's going to have on, smaller subs of subs, mom and pop shops. They just might be making, a screw that goes into, a ship, and suddenly they have to be compliant. And it's a big undertaking to become compliant, and to meet the standards. So it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure. Like our company, we do hosting and things around private cloud and stuff like that for our customers. So when we first got into doing compliance, we did PCI DSS. So that's like for payment card stuff. And that took us months, and we had to get some new like tech stuff.
Yes.
Right. We had to upgrade some things in our systems in order to be compliant, including some auditing software that kind of just supplement to kind of prove we're doing all the things. So it was both time consuming and expensive for us at the time. And we're, about a 20-person shop. And so I can just imagine for some of these smaller mom and pop organizations, it's going to be like both sticker shock, both in terms of the extra stuff they have to buy, but to go through the audit as well.
Yes. Yeah. It's not, like you said, it's not just a, hey, we go through this audit and we pass. There has to be a lot implemented, from cybersecurity to, you talked about auditing software, SIM, has to be installed. And just for example, I'm working with somebody right now that they do travel plans for DoD people, and they probably have less than 10 people in their shop, and they're finding out that they have to have a SIM in place, and they're like, what is this? What, how much is this going to cost us? It's just, one thing after another that they just, have a hard time understanding because they've never had to do it.
I'm curious, how many of these different organizations are there now that find themselves in this? Is it thousands? Is it tens of thousands as part of, do you have a sense of like what the scope is of how many organizations that just wake up one day and find themselves having to be compliant?
Yeah, I honestly think it's probably going to be tens of thousands, because like I said, you're going sub to sub to sub. It's all the way flow down that chain, and it's affecting a lot of people that are suddenly going to wake up one day and be like, oh, if I don't get this done, the problem is they're probably going to lose the contract with whoever they have because they're not compliant. So it's a tough situation, and some of them have to evaluate, is it worth me spending all this money for this contract with whoever is supplying them to the DoD? But yeah, they're having to weigh that because it's time, it's money just to get ready for the audit, and then you have to pay for the audit, and then you have to fix things within a certain amount of time. They don't allow gaps or issues to be open for long before they require you to close them. So it's an ongoing process for sure.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast by Nicole Perlroth. I don't know if you are familiar with her or not, but she used to be a tech reporter for the New York Times and specialized in cybersecurity related things. And she wrote a book a few years ago called "They Tell Me This Is How the World Ends," which was about, specifically about cybersecurity. Anyway, she did a podcast recently with this company called Rubrik. They do like data backups and things like that. And it was called To Catch a Thief. But it specifically talked about China and the threat of China, and just looking back over the last approximately 10 years or so, and how the government of China has, kind of stolen. There's a lot of intellectual property theft that has happened around this. So, but yeah, I think in particular, I think I bring that up just because I wonder that might be something that some of these smaller organizations that are kind of grumbling is just like, why do I have to do this? It's like, well, if you really knew the whole picture, if you knew the story of what's motivating DoD to do this, and you listen to this podcast, it might be an eye opener just to understand, like the threat of what we're up against there.
Exactly. And to your point too, I know a couple of years ago, I don't know if you heard, but a lot of people were buying certain video cameras that they were installing within their facilities, and those video cameras were supported through China. So the government actually came out with a statement saying you can't use these cameras anymore because they're Chinese basically, and we don't know what information they're stealing. So I had some customers that had to go through and switch out all their video cameras because they were using, those that aren't supposed to be used anymore. So yeah, it's interesting. And yeah, I think they're infiltrated more than we realize.
Which I guess there's an opportunity there as well, because if you're saying, okay, we can't use the Chinese cameras anymore, where are those cameras going to come from? Is it going to be, ones that we make here in America, or just like we can control like the final assembly piece, just to make sure that that it's not sending information out or leaking that? And that could also be another, part of the supply chain as well, I would imagine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, especially if they're monitoring some of the facilities, those get looked at as well.
So what does this look like in terms of doing an audit? So if I'm a small company and I come to you, it's just like, all right, let's do this. What is this going to take? Like, how much time and, what are typically the steps involved in doing an assessment and going through an audit?
Yeah, quite a few, to be honest. Typically, we recommend that people start out with like a readiness assessment or a gap assessment so we can actually get a clear picture of what is in place and what isn't in place. And that's usually pretty quick. It takes a couple of weeks. It doesn't take us long to figure out what's not in place. And then from there, we help the organization create like an implementation map and guideline and help them pick out the tools that they need, implement them where we can, make sure they're configured properly. And then we do another quick assessment at the end of that. And that takes several months, depending on, how flexible and available the client is. But there's also a lot of documentation in place. For CMMC, there is a document called the System Security Plan, or the SSP, another fun acronym. But basically that documents how all the controls are implemented. So not only do you have to implement these 110 controls, you have to implement very detailed you have to document how very detailed they are implemented, because that's what the auditors are going to use for their audit. So we help with that documentation and then with any of the policies and procedures that are required as well. So that typically takes, I'd say, between 3 to 6 months, again, depending on how long the client's available. And then from there, you have to bring in a third-party auditor who is actually going to come in and review everything that you've documented within that SSP, making sure it's accurate. But then on top of that, they're going to go look at how that control is actually implemented to make sure it matches what you've documented and the actual control itself. So that takes several weeks, maybe a month, from evidence collection to the auditor actually being on site to when they write their final report. And then, if you pass, great. If you don't, you might have to do it again. And each time is going to cost you even more money. So it's not a overnight process for sure.
How often do companies need to sort of go through that? Is it an annual thing where they go through and they get the checkbox, yay, I passed? And then do they need to follow up every year, every other year? What is that?
I think right now is every 3 years. But there might, that might change. Obviously this is the first time that this is going through. But right now every 3 years. And I know there's starting to be a backlog with the actual third-party auditors because so many people since last year have woken up and said, oh, we need this, so they're starting to get backlogged on their side as well, because there aren't too many C3POs out there right now, and they're getting busy.
Yeah. So what is the C3PAO? Another acronym?
Yes. Oh my gosh. So many. C3PAOs is your certified third-party audit organization. So the audit has to be performed by one of those teams because they have gone through the accreditation process. They have gone through all the training and they have been signed off as basically, yes, you are an official auditor.
So they're like the CPAs that come in and
exactly
give the stamp of approval at the end of the day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And their people have to go through specific training as well. They have to have certain acronyms behind their name to get there. That in itself is a process too to become a C3PAO these days.
So when you're doing these gap assessments, like what are the things that you typically see? Are we talking like gap, like mind the gap? Just like, all right, just there's a little bit of a gap here, or is it like a chasm of stuff that they have to go through?
Usually it's a chasm, I'll be honest, especially if their whole environment's in scope. They might have, pieces of security, but things might not be all implemented. Some things that we see a lot of is, going back to the auditing, the SIM, which takes all the audit logs and provides, reports and correlates things. That has to be implemented, and that affects like several of the controls. You also need to make sure access is appropriate for everybody. You need to make sure things are encrypted and backed up. But the thing that really is kind of making people struggle is around the data classification of, CUI and how to protect that. So it's either staying within the organization, not leaving the organization. If it's being printed, then you have to kind of worry about your printer being in scope. So you're trying not to print CUI. It's a lot of different things that people just don't think about. And all of a sudden they have to have in place now.
So what is CUI? CUI, I imagine, is the thing that we're trying to protect.
Yes. Yep. That is the controlled unclassified information. So that goes back to the diagrams and the plans and the stuff we touched on a little bit earlier. But sometimes things will come through email, and then you have to make sure that doesn't get distributed, even further. But it has to be marked CUI if it is CUI, and if it comes in as CUI, then you have to make sure it stays marked as CUI. You have to have proper distribution requirements around that document, plan, spec, whatever it is.
And I would imagine that with all of these kind of new technologies that people are starting to adopt, like AI, that adds even more complexity into the mix. Is there any guidance, or what do you see as far as these smaller organizations and using AI? Do you just come in and tell them, please stop doing that, or they're not? Do you see that being an additional issue?
Definitely. We definitely see AI as an issue. There are some new frameworks out there. NIST has got AI risk management framework. And there's also a ISO 42001 framework that, actually requires, or you can get done by a third party auditor as well, who's accredited. But basically, those frameworks are good guidance on how AI should be governed within the organization. So you kind of look at it as anything from a risk standpoint, as well as how are people using it? What information are they putting in it? Do we know where that information is going at the end of the day? For example, ChatGPT, do we know where that's ending up? Is that ending up here in the United States? Is that getting sent to China? We just don't know. So there should be some governance in each of the organizations that tells your team members how they can or cannot be using AI. And putting CUI, classified information, sensitive information is definitely a no-no.
Yeah, I wonder with that, is it enough? Because there's just take ChatGPT, for example. If you just use the free version of it, then they're going to train on your data. It's kind of like Google. Anything that you type in, Google is going to remember, who knows, maybe forever. But if you sign up for the paid version of it, then in theory, you can check a little box and say, no, please don't train on my data.
Right.
Then we're trusting that they actually follow that and do
exactly.
that. And then some other companies like Anthropic have you can sign up for AI for your whole company and distribute licenses for different team members. So there's a little more granularity around those kinds of things. To your knowledge, is that good enough? Is that kind of does that follow under the guidelines of what would be following these new ISO standards?
I think it's a little bit better. But like you said, it's can you trust them? And do we know where the data is being stored? If you have your own learning management system within your own network and you control the back end, that's ideal. But if you're using even the paid version, again, you could probably use it a little bit more, but I still wouldn't put any sensitive data in there because, again, you don't know where it's being stored or if they're actually following what they say they're going to follow. So that's always my worry from a privacy standpoint too.
So I guess that brings us to just the concept of the cloud. And so maybe similarly, a lot of organizations might be using different kinds of cloud services. I don't know if it's possible to even, I'm sure it's possible, but it's not easy to just do email, right?
Right.
And if all these things are, information is being passed through email, well, email is a cloud service. Hey, I got my Outlook 365. I'm, maybe using Gmail, a paid version of Gmail, something like that. How does that work in terms of what you're looking at from an auditor standpoint?
Yeah. So typically we look at what's being used. A lot of these major companies, Microsoft, Google, have gone through their own strict requirements and strict audits on their side. And so as long as they're using one of the certified versions of, Gmail or Outlook or whatever, we're usually okay with that. And it depends on the type of audit too. When you start getting into some of the government stuff outside of the DoD, you have to make sure that they meet a certain standard, a certain certification level as well. And so we have to always verify that. So it's kind of a mishmash of what are you using, what are you using it for, and kind of where is it within kind of your scope, your boundary, so to say, of the network.
Yeah, because I know that Microsoft has like a federal approved version. I'm using air quotes when I say
Yes.
that, but the federal approved version of, their 365 suite, that different government agencies might use that isn't the same as what the public uses. I'm sure the price tag is a lot more, right? But
Agreed.
but they have more security and just, I think, a physical separation as well on Microsoft's side to say, okay, there's a special data center, which we do things differently at this data center to meet all these different federal regulations and stuff like that. Hopefully the mom and pop shops don't have to sign up for like those kinds of things, because I would imagine that would make the price of these things go up even more. So
not to that level. Microsoft, since we're talking about Microsoft, they have several levels of things that have gone through the FedRAMP certification. So you can go out to the FedRAMP marketplace, they call it, and look to see what's all been authorized to use for that. And it's been audited and verified by a third party. It's gone through a lot of due diligence for them to get to that point. So you can feel a little bit better and sleep a little bit better at night if you're using one of those approved services.
What are the requirements as far as around things like tracking incident response? Because it's one thing to come in and, set up a bunch of software and, maybe you have something like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or Microsoft Defender on your network. It's like, okay, if the bad guys ever get in, this alarm's going to go off, and then you'll know you need to do something. It's like, all right, I'm done. See you later. Good luck with all of those things. If something happens and the alarm goes off, and let's be fair, the alarm is definitely going to go off at some point. What kinds of things do you recommend as an auditor for them to keep on top of that? Do they need to sign up for like some ongoing like managed service, or like a virtual chief information officer that can help, guide them over time, just to kind of make sure that all of these new tools and toys, some of them are going to be, as they're starting to alarm and do things and whatnot, that they can actually do something about it?
Yeah, great question. Incident response is such a huge part of organizations these days. I would say it depends on their budget, honestly. Managed service provider could be great if they're monitoring 24/7. So when those alarms go off, they kind of do the first level of due diligence if they're doing their job properly. I will say that because I've found some managed service providers that are not doing their job properly. So always vet who you're going to use there. But yeah, so they'll typically do the first level. They'll check to make sure whether it's a false positive, see if they can fix it, themselves. And if they can't, then a lot of them typically, will raise it up to, the organization itself and notify them and being like, hey, we've discovered this. We've done, the tier 1 review. This isn't helping. Now we need to get in there and do more in-depth research. Same thing if virtual CISO, if you don't want a managed service provider, you can have the alerts come to somebody who agrees to be kind of on call 24/7, but that means they have to answer their phone when the incident happens in the middle of the night. So you want to make sure you have people to staff for that. And then on top of that, you have to track your incidents. That's a requirement. So you have to track them as they come in. You have to track how you analyze them, how you fix them, when it occurred. There's a lot of documentation on the backside of an incident too. After you fix the incident, then you have to do root cause analysis. So it's definitely a process. And if it's something that your team can't handle, then definitely recommend bringing in some experts for those sort of things, and that can help manage and guide through, an incident process. And then outside of that, if it's really bad, you can bring in a forensics team, if you have to dive even deeper into it. And that's, unfortunately another cost, but hopefully you don't get to that point.
When you're doing these assessments for people, speaking of incident response, do you end up finding along the way, it's like, yeah, it looks like they did have some kind of ransomware, or they were hit with something in the past. And so is that a more and more common thing that you're running into?
It's getting there, especially on the ransomware side. But I'll be honest, sometimes I go into organizations and they're like, no, we haven't had any incidents. Well, they hadn't been monitoring for anything. So
Oh, right.
there might
Yeah.
be somebody already in their system and they just never knew it because they didn't have the proper monitoring and alerting in place. So that's unfortunately more of the case than what we have. But we have run into some people who have had, the ransomware or bad malware or viruses in their organization. So yeah, you got to have the monitoring and learning in place, hopefully, and then you can discover what you have. But yeah, when the cop shop said, oh, well, no, we haven't had anything. I'm like, okay, we'll see about that.
So going back to the classification piece, I'm just curious there because if these shops are like, okay, I have to protect this information, it seems like it'd be easier to just make like a special little, I don't know what you call it, but just like a quarantine or contained area that's like, okay, if we're ever dealing with these kinds of plans or these kinds of, emails or just any kind of information having to do with this thing that we're making, then it's only happens over here, this little quarantine area on these servers, on these laptops, everything else, the peas don't touch the potatoes sort of thing. So let's just try to minimize where the peas are. We don't like peas that much anyway. So let's just keep those peas over here. Is that one of the strategies typically that you start out with?
Yes, if we can. So we call that an enclave, a separate enclave usually, where it's the CUI, again, the controlled unclassified information is kept. It doesn't go out of there. If it gets uploaded or delivered there, it stays there. And that can definitely limit the scope of the audit and the engagement. So that's usually the easiest thing to do is if you can segment it in a secure manner, then that is typically the only part that would be assessed. Because it's not touching, like you said, it's not touching the rest of the vegetables. The peas are over here, green beans and carrots are over there. So yeah, definitely a good recommendation.
You mentioned earlier, like having something on site. So is that something that they can typically do by just setting up certain systems on premise or on site themselves? Or does it mean it's like, well, there's really too much here. We need to figure out some kind of cloud hosting setup and just have it be in a secure enclave in the cloud?
It depends on how they're going to use it. Honestly, it's sometimes easier to put it in the cloud. I know there are a bunch of organizations that can build a secure enclave, or they have already built one and they just spin it up for you, and then you can, put your data in there. If you have physical servers, it brings into scope a little bit more of the physical environment as well. So that's why I say it's a little bit easier to do it in the cloud, because that way you can kind of scope out the physical aspect of it. But if you have to print it, then, you might have to include some of those physical servers and printers and stuff into scope as well. So that's our goal, is to try to decrease the scope as much as possible. So you're not having to have the whole thing audited. And so if we can convince your team not to print anything, well, that's great. We'll, set that rule within the data classification tool that we're using, and no one's able to print anything. And that means you don't have to buy a new printer and you don't have to have physical environment in your scope, if that's the case.
It's funny because those are things that people don't really think about, like a printer, for example.
Yep. And there's a special printer that you have to have if you are going to print things now. That's lockdown protected. And so you would have to buy that printer, which is not cheap because it meets all the standards. So that's why a lot of our customers are like, maybe we don't need to print this. Like, it's not necessary. And we're like, cool. Let's scope that out. Let's make sure, configurations are set so no one can print that document, because they just want to scribble on it on their desk. It's easier. But again, that brings in your whole physical office and the printer into scope.
It's wild because people don't, as I said, people don't think about that, but a printer really is a computer. I'd gone to a security conference many years ago, and it's Black Hat security conference. So there's like the hacker types are talking about the different kinds of, antics and whatnot that they get up to. But this one guy was talking about how he specialized in hacking printers. And so he would get on the network and he would just focus on attacking the printer. But then once he took the printer over, that gave him like a foothold on that network. And, he would use that as a way to like break into other systems. And even if they kicked him out of these other systems, he could still get back into the printer and like scan the network and do all these other things just from the printer. And so, yeah, that That one always stuck with me in terms of all the different talks that I've heard down through the years. It's just like, wow, that was a pretty wild thing to specialize in, just
Yeah,
doing these printers.
definitely.
But yeah,
But I mean, it works. So, if he does it, he's not the only one that does it.
exactly. Yes. Giving ideas to people.
Helping out the hackers out there.
Not that I think they need a lot more of it,
No.
but yeah.
Definitely not. They're doing just fine on their own. Yeah. I would say security is more reactive right now because the hackers, I think, are always like a couple steps ahead of us. And we're just trying to like fix the holes that they find. And then as they find more, and then we have to fix those. So it's more of a reactive process for cybersecurity than a proactive one right now. So hopefully one day that'll change.
Yeah. I think doing these things, like if you have enough, look, if it's going to be, I think we have to accept a certain amount of inconvenience. This is how I look at it. Like if you want things to be secure, really secure, it's going to be relatively inconvenient for you. So I think that's part of it. Like the more inconvenient it is for you, the more inconvenient it's going to be for the hacker as well. And then maybe after a while, they're just like, you know what? I'm not going to bother with you. I'd rather just go to the place down the street. They're easier to break into. Like you have a strong lock on the door. You have a barbed wire fence now. It looks like you have a dog. Like it's too much of a hassle for me to do these things. Just like it's a hassle for you because you have to unlock this gate and go in here and then, okay, it's your dog. So you pet the dog. So the dog isn't
Get the
an
dog a
issue for
treat.
you. But you have extra layers of things that you need to go through. I think if people tell themselves, you know what, these extra layers, it's a little inconvenient, but it's going to be inconvenient, hopefully, for the hackers as well.
No, that's a great point because we're actually going through that now with one of our customers because the CUI, they don't provide mobile devices to their employees. So everyone has a phone that they just attach to the network, in itself is kind of a risk. But now when you're dealing with CUI, and the configurations we're putting in place to manage the data flow of that, we're having to lock down mobile devices where they can't receive their email or Teams messages on their personal mobile device because they don't want the mobile device managed by, the organization. So that means they're either going to have to buy new cell phones and manage them and give them to people who actually need email and Teams on their phone, or people just aren't going to be able to access email and Teams on their phone for now. And, maybe they just have to do things on their laptop instead. So it's definitely a tricky balance of trying to find, how hard can we lock things down, but not be too inconvenient to the organization. But also they have to understand that there are, like you said, there are going to be some hassles. There are going to be some extra doors that they have to jump through if they want this, certification to work with, the DoD or the subcontractors.
So as we mentioned earlier, like this is relatively new, the CMMC process. And I think with anything related to the government tends to move a little slower than the rest of, the industry. And so CMMC has been probably in the works through, you mentioned NIST, been in the works for a while. So do you know like how long has this been sort of in the works and is it fully enforceable now? Like, what is the status around just the deadlines and whatnot for CMMC?
Yeah, I'd say it's been in the works for a while. I first started seeing it pop up probably about 8-9 years ago. And it wasn't CMMC at that time. It was a DFARS requirement, so a federal requirement, which required, again, DoD individuals to comply with the NIST 800 and 171, which is again the standard that CMMC is based off of. So we were helping DoD contractors at that time implement that standard. And then a couple of years after that, it started to become more of a conversation of, okay, great, now people have had it implemented, like the DoDs themselves, direct contractors and primes have it implemented. How are we actually going to verify that this is, being done? Because at that point, it was more of a self-assessment, like here's what you have to put in place. Here's your score. And I think they were finding people that were lying on them. I know you're shocked. Saying, yeah, all of my security is in place, Sure. And I got a perfect score. Yeah, that doesn't happen. So I think they started seeing more and more of that, of kind of things aren't actually matching up. And so they decided, I would say probably it started pre-COVID because so probably 2019, maybe late 2018, they started discussing like, how are we going to build this board? How are we going to be able to certify these organizations? And then COVID obviously messed things up for several years. So it's been in the works for a while, but then it was still self-assessment. And then now within this last year, if you aren't dealing directly with CUI, but you're dealing with FCI, just to confuse you, federal contract information, you don't have to have all the 110 controls in place. You only have to have like maybe 20, and you could self-attest. But if you're dealing directly with CUI, they are going to start putting that CMMC requirement into contracts starting this November. So if organizations are dealing with CUI and they're not certified by that time, they might not be able to bid on any of the new contracts that are coming out after November, depending on their status and, where they stand with the certification. So that's why a lot of people are hearing about it, between last year and this year. It's now real because it's going in contracts and the requirement is there. Yeah.
So it's coming up this November.
Correct.
Okay. So how many different levels or layers? Because you mentioned there's still this layer with FCI where they can just self-attest so that I can say, oh, yes, I've gone through and, I meet your requirements and I signed the dotted line to say I do so, and then I'm good. So that's maybe one layer, but how many different levels or layers are there?
There are currently 3. So most people are at that level 2, which is just, standard CUI. There is a 3rd level that I don't think they're enforcing quite yet. I haven't dealt with level 3 yet too much, but it's basically the 110 controls plus additional controls. So that is for, I think, people who are handling either a ton of CUI or need to have stricter requirements or controls around it. So it's a lot more intense. But like I said, most people are at that level 2 right now. And that's where we've been kind of focused on helping those customers get ready for their audits.
Okay, so there's 3 levels. The level 2 though is the one that's where most people fall in, because it's I'm just trying to think about, these acronyms are kind of funny because it's like CUI, so it says certified unclassified. So the first thing I thought is like, well, it's classified, but it's not
Nope.
technically classified,
Correct.
right? Because that just stays within the government, or maybe just certain ones, certain contractors that meet some other kind of requirement to deal with the real classified stuff, right? So this is like supporting information that's not technically like the super top secret stuff. It's just the supporting unclassified stuff, but it's still important. So just to be getting the terminology right, just wrapping my brain around that part.
No, it's okay. Like we said, there's so many acronyms in the government where when you're working with them, it's confusing sometimes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the government's perspective, when they're rolling this out, it makes sense that they just started with the attestation part because they just want to get it on people's radar, right? It's just like, this is coming, right? For now, we're just going to let you do it yourself, but just know, like, we're going to come knocking on your door later and be asking for, not just you to say that you're good, but that Lori says that you're good, or, Lori prepared you for the actual auditor to say that you're good. So yeah,
it's tricky. I know like a lot of people, especially during the self-attestation, would have to score themselves, like I said, but then they'd have to enter that score up into a certain website that, contractors could review. And that's where we're always putting, I have everything, they scored 110, but we know that's not reality for most of them. There's so many nuances with standards. It's, unless you are very familiar with the standard and cybersecurity, you might miss anyways. So it's good to have a second pair of eyes helping with that.
And it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense to me that the DoD is the one that's is behind CMMC. You mentioned NIST earlier, which is the National Institute for Standards, and they're the ones that ultimately had come up with like, here's what we're talking about, listing all these different things out. And of course, I don't know if they're working closely together, but they're at least aware of what each other is doing there. You mentioned the NIST 800-171 is basically what this is based off of. As far as like, are there other NIST related things that are going to be coming as well? Or is it just enough just to get people just to do this particular one? They've kind of packaged it together and say, this is CMMC, you need to do this. Or is there going to be even more stuff, as far as you know, that's going to be coming down after this?
In regards to Department of Defense, I don't know of anything else coming down. I will say that there is another standard that's pretty well known. It's the NIST 853, which actually the NIST 800 and 171, the CMMC standard, is, I call it a slimmed down version of that NIST 853. But that NIST 853 was developed first for anyone working with federal agencies. And so if they had physical servers, or if they're working directly with a physical, or if they're working directly with the federal agency, they would have to comply with the NIST 853 standard. That was then taken by the government later, and they said, if we want to work with products that are in the cloud, they need to go through a certain certification. So we were talking about Microsoft earlier, going through their federal requirement. And so now anyone that has a product or service in the cloud that wants to sell to a federal agency, they have to go what's called FedRAMP, which is based on that NIST 853. So if you ever hear of FedRAMP, that's what it's talking about. It's those specifically in the cloud that are selling to the federal government. And then recently, within the last couple of years, the states have decided that they're also going to do something very similar. So they have what's called GovRAMP now, and that is state and local counties, schools, etc. If you're working with any of them, they might require you to have that standard in place as well. So it's a lot more controls than the NIST 800 and 171 for CMMC, and it's a lot more in depth, but it opens up more doors if you're working with, the government, either state or federal. But same sort of process. You have to go through a third-party auditor to get that certification. You have to have the documentation we talked about. You have to have the controls in place. So it's not a short process either, but that's the other compliance standard out there. But NIST also has great frameworks. If you're just looking for like a risk management framework, they have one. We talked about incident response earlier. That's a great place. NIST has an incident response framework that tells you exactly what should be in your incident response plan, the steps that should be in there. I think they have like charts and stuff in there as well. So that's great. And then I mentioned the AI risk management framework earlier as well. And that's one of the newer ones that, you might hear more about. So it's a great agency. They're, trying to put out documents to protect, obviously, organizations, but also to protect the federal government. I know that there are a lot of acronyms and numbers out there.
Yeah.
What can I clarify?
No, I mean, it makes sense, right? That NIST is the one that's really saying, okay, here's exactly the different things that you can do. It's maybe, I don't know, just like the detailed recipe book of like, here's the recipe of all the different ingredients that you would need to have in order to be able to fulfill these different things. So like you mentioned, FedRAMP or incident response or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's like you said, it's all the ingredients. You're baking a cake. You're trying to get through an audit. And so you kind of follow that. And there are a lot of controls in there, but, they're, for the most part, they're pretty good controls. And basic controls that you need, like access control. We talked about physical security, some stuff around personnel security too, making sure people have background checks. Just things that should be in place anyways to have a good security program within the organization.
Yeah, we ourselves had looked at doing FedRAMP, and we still might, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot in dollar
is.
sign, and it's a lot in terms of additional things you have to do. So we go through PCI, which is Payment Card Industries, PCI DSS for the kinds of things that we do at our organization. And then we also do like HIPAA and high tech, which is healthcare related stuff. And then there's another one called SOC, which is just more around like what your internal processes are. But each one of these things that you want to get certified in, an auditor has to come and do. And so then it's just like cha-ching. That's another thing you have to pay for. Cha-ching, pay for that one. Get this red stamp. So, and then to do the FedRAMP one, that was a lot of cha-chings in there. That was, yeah. And the interesting thing is once you kind of do one of them, you get a lot of the sort of groundwork in
There's
place,
a lot of
right?
leverage. Yeah.
Yeah. So you don't have to change a bunch of things. It's like what we're doing with PCI, most of that stuff just rolls over, and that applies to HIPAA as well. Each has maybe special things that they focus on that the other doesn't. So, which is great, and that's why we need those things. With FedRAMP, I think it was similar, where like we're already most of the way there, but you still have to go through the whole process again to say, okay, I know we just checked, even if it's the same auditor that we go through for PCIs with HIPAA. I know we just checked these boxes, and we'll look at it again, but we have to check the boxes again as well. But with FedRAMP, I think that one was like a 4 or 5 year commitment, I'll say, where you have to go. The first one's the hardest, kind of like boot camp. You have to go through and just like, all right, we're going to get this done, and then you get the checkbox, and then because it covers so much, you kind of go year over year. You do, okay, we're going to recertify this part, and then next year it's recertify the next part. It's kind of like, I equate it to kind of like painting the Golden Gate Bridge, right? You're not going to repaint the Golden Gate Bridge every year. You're just going to paint it, and then when you get to the end, you're gonna start over again. It may take you 5 years
Right.
to repaint the Golden Gate Bridge, but that's how I remember it being. Is that accurate as far as with FedRAMP?
It is for now. So it's typically, if it's your first time going through it, typically takes about 12 to 18 months to actually from start to finish. And that means finish by getting listed on the website for FedRAMP and going through the audit. But then, like you said, the first year is really, you have to make sure all the controls are in place. The auditor is going to look at all the controls. And then after that, the next 3 years, they're going to just pull a sample of controls. So with a FedRAMP moderate classification, which is what most people have, there are about 350-ish controls. So those are the ones that you get tested the first year. And then after that, you have to test about 160 over the next several years and to maintain that certification. So, but they are working really hard at trying to streamline the process a little bit. It's called FedRAMP 20X. I don't know if you heard of that, but they're trying to streamline the process where you don't actually have to have an agency sponsor anymore. And you can just skip that part of trying to find an agency to sponsor you to work with. And you can just go through the audit with whatever you have. And they're also trying to pull some automated tools in and scripts in to make the whole process a little bit quicker. They just did their first kind of test phase for several organizations on the low classification last year. And now they're kind of reworking that to see if I think they're going to run another test later this year. So that's the good news. They're trying to speed it up, but as quickly as government moves, it might be a little bit longer than than they had initially asked or thought, especially with all these shutdowns lately.
Yeah, I had forgot about that. I remember when we were looking at the FedRAMP piece, there's the two components, which is just doing the audit and, all the rigmarole around that itself, which is plenty and also plenty expensive. But if that's not enough, folks, you can't actually go through and do this until you get an agency that sponsors you, right? So it's like it's kind of a chicken and egg thing otherwise,
Yes.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
How can I get certified so that I can, be able to offer services to an agency? But an agency isn't going to sort of isn't going to hire me until I have that certification. So the sponsorship is kind of what helps bridge that gap. It's like, all right, they say, we like you, we like what you're doing. And if you were interested, but now we're apparently just going to wait 12 to 18 months while you go through the boot camp and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think FedRAMP did kind of figure that out. And so now they have what's called a readiness assessment, where you don't have to have a federal agent sponsor to do the readiness. It actually shows agencies that, hey, we're ready. We've met these critical controls. We have them in place. And you can stay FedRAMP ready, I think, for a year while you're looking for that sponsor and putting the rest of the controls in place. So that's always an option. But I've had customers who did implement everything and then they couldn't find a sponsor and they just couldn't move on. They spent all that money, all those resources getting ready. And then at the end of the day, they're like, well, no one's going to help us. So it's kind of, it's like you says, it's a difficult situation, that chicken and the egg. So hopefully they'll get that reestablished, that new process soon.
Well, it seems like if somebody's gone through the trouble to go through all of the FedRAMP stuff, if they can't get an agency to sponsor them, then maybe they can turn their attention to some of these smaller organizations that are part of the defense industrial base that, it's not a federal agency, but, they would need some help. They are definitely going to need some help.
Yes.
Because, there's a lot of them out there that now suddenly have to maybe not do all the things that the federal agency needs to do, but they need to do it, a subset of that. So
Definitely recommend it. But both of them are their own unique. The government likes to do things differently, and they definitely do both of those a little bit differently than your standard like PCI and SOC and stuff like that. But those are great starting points. Like I said, a lot of the basic controls go from framework to framework, and you can even find mappings, out there. Because NIST 153 is so well known, it maps to the ISO. SOC is a little bit different, but PCI, HIPAA, I think there's all mappings that could show you what controls will meet some of the NIST 153 FedRAMP standards based on your other ones. And then you can just focus on, the new ones. But again, I know we talked about earlier about CMMC having a special enclave where you're only auditing, that small enclave. We have customers that do the same thing for FedRAMP because they don't want their whole organization under this purview. So they build it, basically duplicate the environment, build it specifically for FedRAMP, get that smaller portion assessed. And that way they can do their PCI and other stuff on the regular organization and then, have their FedRAMP enclave over there that's dedicated to that. So we see a lot of customers split it like that because it's just easier at the end of the day for them.
I think that makes a lot of sense as long as they can, follow those boundaries, right? But if you can do that, it is easier to keep the peas separate from the potatoes. And I think, it makes sense from a, just information security standpoint. I think a lot of us have been spoiled with just, the ease of use of everything. It's like, wow, I get my iPhone and I can do all these things. I connect to all these things. It has all these apps and the cloud and all this sort of stuff. And click, 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 it's just all there. It's super convenient for me. And, I think it's just taking a step back and saying, okay, we need to, there's the stuff maybe you do when you have your consumer hat on and I'm, this isn't work related. And then you can have those kind of easy, convenient things. But on the work side of things, we need to put these extra things in place to make it more secure. And we're sorry it is going to be a tad or a lot more inconvenient as a result.
Yeah, definitely. And especially with FedRAMP and CMMC too, it's like in the boundary, you have to use certain tools that are already certified, especially for FedRAMP. Like, so if you're going back to the Microsoft example, if you're using Microsoft, they have to be the accredited version of Microsoft for your FedRAMP project. But the good thing about that is you can inherit some of their controls too. If since you're all in the cloud, you can inherit a lot of their physical security controls because they've already gone through that 3PAO assessment. So that's always a good thing because we can lower that scope. But if you have your entire environment in scope, a lot of problems I've seen have come around ticketing systems, believe it or not. If your ticketing system is not FedRAMP compliant, you're going to have to swap that out through the whole organization. And that's usually a more expensive product. So, some of those tools that you use on the day-to-day side, you might not need the extra security or you want to pay the extra hefty fee to move that to that FedRAMP certified product. So again, that's why people consider going into that lower, that smaller kind of subset or the enclave for, the FedRAMP environment. It's just a lot to think about when you're doing things like that. And that's where we try to help too, is like, let's look at the organization as a whole. How are you going to do? What tools do you currently have in place? And we can help you decide, is it easier to build something separate or is it easier to, integrate this into the current environment?
Yeah, even talking about a ticketing system, I think some of these organizations, maybe the bigger ones, they might even just outsource ticketing completely, just like you would a call center. It's just like our 800 number just goes to this other thing that's maybe not even in the US. So does our ticketing system. And I know there's been some cybersecurity breaches related to those ticketing systems where, the bad guys will open a ticket with support or call support and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I need you to reset my password. And, the support people are trying to be helpful on those ticketing systems. They're like, sure, I'll reset your password. Give me, your mother's maiden name or something.
Yep.
And they found that online. It's just like, all right, cool.
Yep.
Password reset. In you go.
Yep. What's your
yeah.
pet's name?
What's your pet's name? Exactly. That might be a little bit harder, but yeah, find out the guard dog's name,
exactly.
and now you're in. But do those kinds of things fall under these kind of controls as well, where they're looking at the human element of like, okay, who's actually resetting passwords? Like, what is that process? If someone opens a ticket, okay, sure, we make sure that ticketing system falls under certain kind of requirements, but who's using the ticketing system? How do you reset passwords? Does that fall under it too?
It does. Yeah. There are some controls around verifying the identity of the person. But like you said, if they've gone out there and already, know the mother's maiden name, that might be different. So there are other ways you can do it. You can have like a secret code, or you have to call from a validated phone number, other certain ways to kind of validate the identity of that person that's calling for help and getting that password reset, because it is, unfortunately, humans are the biggest weakness in organizations, and it's because, like you said, everyone's trying to be nice, like tailgating and, data centers was a big thing for such a long time when people actually had data centers because people would just hold the door open for them. But you don't know if that person is allowed to go into the data center, the physical data center or not. It's just people
but
are trying to be nice and
orange
friendly.
vest on.
Yeah, exactly.
They look like they were important. Yeah.
So yeah, they are trying to be helpful, but unfortunately, sometimes that's not what cybersecurity needs. They need people who are more cautious in instances like that.
So if I'm an organization that wants to get started doing this, maybe doesn't want to, but feels compelled to.
Nobody wants
to. because well, you want to, because it's just like, hey, that contract that you're bidding on.
Exactly.
Yeah. You need to check this box first. So if an organization wants to get started to fulfill that process, and they contact somebody like you, like, what do they need to go through first? They have to go through, it sounds like what you do is this gap assessment piece, and that's how they get started. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, because from there, we do a quick assessment against, the controls to see what's in place, what's not in place. And that really helps us understand the environment as a whole. We'll also probably ask some organizational questions too, to make sure that we're scoping it appropriately, because again, going to scope, you want to make sure it's scoped as small as possible so you don't have to audit as much or put as many tools in. So that's where kind of the first couple weeks are, is making sure we've scoped it appropriately, going through the controls at a high level. Do you have this in place? Do you not have this in place? And then we can help with the roadmap and the implementation on the back end of that. Because it is difficult, and a lot of the smaller organizations, small, medium-sized organizations don't have extra people to do this right now. Staffing's already slim, budget's already slim, and they're wondering how they're going to support this effort. And that's kind of where we come in as part of a team to help you get there. And then, we can help after, as well as a, virtual CISO on a monthly basis, so you don't have to hire somebody full-time to do it. You got support for part-time, basically. And we know what we're doing. We've been doing it for a long time now. So we can definitely get you over that line.
Wow, this has been great, Lori. I've learned a lot about CMMC. I've did a little bit of research, and I've been trying to learn more about it. But yeah, this has been great, trying to piece this apart and figure out what all the different controls and moving parts are as far as CMMC
and
goes.
Acronyms.
Yeah, and acronyms. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm glad it's helpful. I love trying to help people with this, because I know it's difficult. It's not easy, and that's my goal, is just to help people through this mess and try to take the standards and kind of make them as least complicated as possible, so everyone kind of understands what they're getting into at the end of the day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in to Data and Confused. I really appreciate you listening. Please go ahead and subscribe as I get this podcast off the ground. I have a lot of amazing guests planned, industry experts and thought leaders from the tech and cybersecurity world. So look forward to seeing you in future episodes. Thank you.